Trashy's bridal bites. If you love it and you hate yourself for it, the odds are it.
It's the 1980s, 1989 to be specific, and I'm in high school, a freshman. And wandering the halls, you could hear snippets of conversations, as you always do. And some of the things you heard were downright filthy. And the other thing is they were all the same, because they were all coming from the same source. One name had a hold, particularly on the teen and 20s crowd in the world of stand-up comedy, which had gone through a massive explosion in the 80s. The small comedy club scene that came about, the actual touring acts that started to pop up in huge venues. But the leader of that was a character. A character attached to a human, of course, but it was a character. A caricature, almost. And yeah, today we're talking about Andrew Dice Clay, the man who almost certainly is the trashiest comic of the 1980s and 90s. Let's go back to Brooklyn. Andrew Dice Clay wasn't known as Andrew Dice Clay back then. He was known as Andrew Clay Silverstein. His dad was a boxer. But Andrew was not a brash, abrasive kid. Actually, he was a drummer. That's a funny thing. He played bar mitzvahs and stuff around as sort of a touring act with various folks. And apparently he was pretty good at it. And he started off in comedy in New York. And New York is a really hard scene to crack into. It really is. And it's the 1970s at this point. He would have been in his early 20s. And he did impressions. And I have to remember who the peak of comedy is in the late 70s in particular. Steve Martin had just released Wild and Crazy Guy. Absolutely massive. You have the start of people like Paula Poundstone. Maybe that's even a little early for Paula Poundstone, but definitely in that area. Rita Rudner. And you still had the folks who were sort of the 50s, 60s, and 70s folks still doing comedy. You had some Bill Cosby stuff, though he had mostly transitioned to acting, but he released a couple of albums. You had the very earliest time of the generation that would become sort of the SNL crowd. Even the ones who weren't on SNL, but were sort of running in that group. You had Mort Sahl and that crowd still around. Folks who legitimately worked alongside Lenny Bruce. And Clay's influences are really interesting. Because while he was clearly influenced by the likes of Lenny Bruce, of Don Rickles, sort of the edgier comics of the time, I think there's a lot of Red Fox in him. And when you look at Red Fox's career, which sort of peaked as a comic in the late 60s, early 70s, as a sort of media figure in the mid 70s, early 80s, Red Fox has a huge, huge impact on both African American and white comics. Whereas someone who you would see more of a direct correlation almost between someone like Rudy Ray Moore and Andrew Dice Clay. Very similar. The alphabet that Rudy Ray Moore does. Very, very filthy. But I don't know how much of an impact he would have had on Dice, but it's clear Red Fox did. And Red Fox's albums from the 60s and 70s, really, really. By 1980, he had moved out to LA. And that was when he started to transition into... And we have this idea, this view of what Andrew Dice Clay was. He was definitely swagger. He would come in the jacket, which I always wanted, still want. He'd have the cigarette. He had the slicked up hair. He was kind of like trying to be an Elvis-like figure. At the same time as trying to be a Morton Downey Jr. figure. That persona hit you before you got to the act. And it wasn't just that he was being offensive to be offensive, because he kind of was. But he was also saying things that he knew everyone else sort of said in their own little head. Particularly when they are socially maladjusted human beings, like all kids were in the 1980s and 90s. What he is best known for, of course, is his dirty nursery rhymes. This bit, I believe he stole from a number of things in Los Angeles. And he didn't really develop that bit until much later on. But when you look at things like The Fox, the Wild West show that were being done in and around Westwood, in and around UCLA, The Fox, of course, would later go on to be on The Man Show, singing his song, I, father, he married a donut, and then all sorts of things like that. And there was a specific comedian, I think it was the Wild West show, it might have been The Fox, who did a series of things like this. And the one I remember specifically was Little Jack Horner. He sat in a corner, he had a square ass. Of course, Dice amped that up. And part of it was he was responding to what had already started popping up by the mid-'80s. It's sort of, we call it politically correct. But political correctness was really just a response to the rise of roles people of color, women, disabled people were having within the national discourse because acceptance had increased, partly due to things like the Civil Rights Act, but there's a whole bunch of both legislative and cultural aspects that are leading to this. And he's absolutely responding to that. And because he is doing heavy material that doesn't require a lot of thought, and if that sounds exactly like today with the conservative debater movements like Whatever and those jerks, you're right. It's exactly feeding off the same idea. It's wanting to be able to say terrible things and reap the rewards from that. And Clay was great at it. He really was. One of the reasons he could get so far was that there was a culture of comedy on television, on VHS, and of course things like Howard Stern and all those radio deals. You were seeing comedy again and again, and Clay tapped into that. Of course, MTV, very helpful. He eventually was banned from MTV. His material was sexually aggressive. I would argue it was misogynistic. It was absolutely homophobic. There was a lot of sort of Jewish jokes that are exactly the type that Jews tell to each other. But where it really gets interesting is when you look at 1990. I believe at this point he had already done his biggest shows at Madison Square Garden, which were huge. They were gigantic. But he was asked to host Saturday Night Live, and he's a natural for that. And the cast was really against it. And in particular, Nora Dunn refused to appear on the episode, and Sinead O'Connor pulled out. Of course, Sinead would have her own issues with Saturday Night Live later, but that's neither here nor there. And the question becomes, was NBC normalizing this by having him on? This is a question we get today still with the hardcore conservatives who are just as racist, just as misogynist, just as homophobic as Andrew Dice Clay, the character, was. He had this sort of appeal that we haven't seen in comedy much since. There's still big comics who do headlining things. You know, the Kings of Comedy hadn't happened yet. That was big. Larry the Cable Guy, Jeff Dunham, those folk. But I will go to my grave saying that The Adventures of Ford Fairlane, the movie that he made, which is basically the Dice Man persona, was fantastic. And there's reasons for that. And it wasn't just that the material he was doing was so much, on brand, but it was just genius in how he understood the insertion of him into the world. He played a PI. And you have his interactions with Morris Day in the time. The script is actually really solid, and Morris Day is written so well. Ed O'Neill is great in it, too. The whole booty time bit is hilarious. Lauren Holly is great in it, but she's great in everything. It's a well-done movie that didn't play to audiences because it wasn't a concert film. So as the 90s moved on, and things did get more politically correct, as they'll say, Andrew Dice Clay didn't quite disappear, but he was no longer where he was. He had a sitcom at one point. He did some writing. He's really a fascinating character, because as a person, when he moved beyond the Andrew Dice Clay persona, there's something behind it. He's a talented performer. And I think in a lot of ways, he is also much like Howard Stern, in that he would rather be the persona saying controversial things, partly as a way to defend the controversy, than he would be just a comedian doing shtick. And while, yeah, we all said terrible things quoting his, I don't think he was a bad comic. I think he delivered everything really well. He understood the tenets of comedy enough to not necessarily break them, except in content type. Whereas when you look at someone like Lenny Bruce, when he got towards the end of his career, where he definitely lost being a comedian, but Dice never did. I don't think there's any doubt that Andrew Dice Clay is trashy. I think it's more so today, if you are listening to Andrew Dice Clay, you're definitely realizing, oh, this is trashy. We've moved on as a culture. The last 30 years have been 100 years in the advancement of ideas of what is and isn't appropriate for entertainment, which is part of why we have this backlash of people saying, freedom of speech means we can offend you. And Clay was saying that for sure. But I think he was saying that more of a defense of his income than anything else. And I think that's important, that we recognize that. These concepts have economic impacts, direct, on individuals. Why aren't they going to stand up for that? They should, and we should smack them down. Now, this whole idea of a trashy comic is not new. It goes way back, and I mentioned some of them here. But when we go to trashy music, it gets a little weirder. And it's not just because of things like Two Live Crew, which I don't actually consider trashy so much. There's some trash there. But they were doing much the same thing that Andrew Dice Clay was, just in the rap world. But when you come to trashy music, I often wonder about the high art of trash. And so next time, we're going to be talking about a band that you can debate trashy all day long. And no matter what decision you come to, you're probably right. And that band is Gwar. So I hope you'll stay tuned, because if you hate yourself for loving it, the odds are it's trashy.
If you love it and you hate yourself for it, the odds are it's trashy. Walk of ice and little take to forget the day on Sakujan's woman's shack with a poke. I cobbling bay forever pennies. I sack with one breath. Strings I untie. It's trash as bridal bites. If you love it and you hate yourself for it, the odds are it's trash, she's right.